and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and as always, I'm glad to have you back here for some more discussion of military history. Today we're going to continue with our look at the development of Japanese amphibious capability between the wars, by looking at some of the ships and small craft that were produced as part of this effort. Sources for the information in this video can be found in the description. So with that said, let's get back to the story. Most of the development of specialized craft for landing operations undertaken in Japan during the decades between the wars was the work of the Shipping Bureau of the Army Transportation Department, the Rikugun Onyubu. The craft and equipment that were produced reflected the Army's determination of the requirements of these operations as a result of their exercises performed in the 1920s, as well as its assumptions of what a landing on a hostile shore would entail. Until the beginning of the war with the United States and the Allies, neither the Japanese Navy nor the nation's shipbuilding industry made much independent contribution in this area. As had been the case with the British and the Americans, the initial focus of the Japanese effort centered on the creation of self-propelled landing craft which could beach and retract independently. These craft were not intended to be ocean-going, but were carried across the sea aboard transport vessels, then lowered into the water and loaded for their assault runs. By 1930, the Japanese created two main types of landing craft. The first of these was the 47-foot or 14-meter Daihatsu, a term which can be translated as large powered boat. This craft, which would become known to the Allies as the Type A, was designed with the lessons of the 1920s landing exercises in mind. Early models were delivered to the Army beginning in 1924. Their combat debut came in the 1932 landings near Shanghai, when the 11th Division used them to go ashore behind the lines of the Chinese 19th Route Army, forcing the Chinese to withdraw from the vicinity of the contested city. The Daihatsu was an open-topped, diesel-powered 21-ton craft capable of delivering around 70 combat troops to a beach and landing them over a bow ramp. Alternatively, you could carry a Type 75 tank, or about 10 tons of supplies and equipment. Some had an enclosed cabin built over the middle of the cargo area. Had a normal crew of 12 men, and could make a speed of about 8 knots. It was basically similar in concept to an American Higgins boat or an LCVP, but was a more seaworthy vessel than either, and its steel hull gave it a fair degree of protection against lighter weapons and shell fragments. The Daihatsu had fittings for a pair of machine guns, and some were modified to carry heavier weapons such as the 37mm infantry gun or 25mm anti-aircraft weapons. Additional armor could also be added in the field, and some Daihatsus were used as improvised gunboats on rivers and other waterways. Those used in this way in Burma were usually camouflaged with vegetation and armed with Type 92 heavy machine guns. Beginning with the early 1924 models, approximately 6,000 Daihatsus were built for both services, the great majority being used by the Army. The other main type of Japanese landing craft was the Shohatsu, or small-powered boat, a 35-foot or 11-meter vessel displacing 4.5 tons. The Allies called this kind of vessel the Type B. It was powered by a 60-horsepower diesel engine and could match the 8-knot speed of the Daihatsu. The Shohatsu was in form a simple open boat with no bow ramp, made of steel and manned by a crew of 5. It was carried aboard destroyers and other small warships as a cargo boat in addition to its use as a landing craft. In the latter role, had a normal load of 35 armed men, or alternatively about 3.5 tons of cargo. Mountings for a single machine gun were fitted. In addition to these two main kinds of landing craft, the Japanese used a wide variety of small craft to put their troops ashore from attack transports. These range from normal shipboard boats such as lifeboats and whaleboats to more exotic types of craft, including flat-bottomed airboats propelled by airplane engines and propellers. Vessels such as sampans and prows built by the indigenous peoples of the region were also commonly used in this way. Basically, any kind of small craft that could be found or captured throughout the area of their control was used in this way by the Japanese at one time or another, including unpowered barges and rafts, even improvised ones made from 55-gallon drum-type containers lashed together and decked over. This was one of many reflections of the widespread reliance on improvisation and determination that was instilled in the men of the Japanese military as a means of compensation for their relative inferiority in material. The concept of landing operations evolved by the Army can be thought of as a normal mechanized assault in which part of the terrain is water, and in which some of the transport is water transport. In this way, the Japanese Army idea of the beach assault has some similarities with a river crossing operation. Landing craft would proceed to the beach in columns, rather than in waves as was more normal with other nations. Where possible, some of the attack force could penetrate inland along creeks and other waterways to land some distance upstream and flank the beach defenses. One reflection of this tactical concept can be seen in the supporting craft which were developed to accompany the landing craft during these operations. The Japanese created specialized boats, carried aboard the attack transports along with the landing craft, to perform specific missions. For example, there were small messenger boats used for liaison and communication purposes between the troops and the ships offshore. In addition, small armed boats were built to scout out the landing beaches and the waterways leading inland from them. These correspond to tactical vehicles used on the land. Perhaps the most distinctive of the specialized support craft built for these landing operations, as well as those which most clearly reveal their origins in land-based tactical thinking, were the Sokotai. These were a family of lightly armored gunboats, which were designed to accompany the landing columns and provide fire support to the troops fighting their way ashore. The first of these was built in 1927. It was named Sakigake, or Pioneer. It's a 14.4 meter or 47 foot, 16-ton vessel powered by gasoline engines. Only slightly larger than the landing craft it would support, the Sakigake was armed with a pair of 6.5mm Type 38 machine guns and a 37mm Type 11 infantry cannon. These were all regular Army infantry weapons, and were mounted in turrets similar to those on contemporary Japanese tanks. Indeed, the Sokotai gunboats can properly be thought of as waterborne fire support tanks. Like their land-based counterparts, they were armed with low-velocity cannons suitable for engaging troop concentrations, as well as field fortifications and other tough but unarmored targets. A second prototype was created in 1930. This one was called the Kachidoke, or Battle Cry. This was somewhat larger than the Sakigake at 20 meters, or 65 feet, and 20 tons displacement. It was powered by diesels rather than gasoline engines, carried a heavier armament of two 7.7mm Type 89 machine guns, and a Type 90 57mm cannon. This latter weapon was also used on contemporary Japanese tanks. The Kachidoke was also fitted with smoke dischargers to enable it to lay down a protective screen for the landing columns. This boat was actually tested in combat during the 1932 Shanghai incident. Here, in landings at the end of January of that year, the Kachidoke engaged Chinese shore defenses and laid a smokescreen for the landing vessels. The effectiveness of its efforts can be gauged by the fact that only 2 Japanese soldiers were lost in these landings. A third prototype was built in 1933. This was called the AB-Te, or the AB-3, AB standing for Armored Boat. It retained the armament of the Kachidoke, but was structurally refined so as to save size and weight, resulting in a 15.5 meter or 51 foot, 17.5 ton craft. It also featured a better engine and had a higher top speed. This third prototype was chosen for production, and 24 including the prototype were built. A revised version of this model, slightly larger and faster than the AB-3, was adopted in 1937, and 10 of these larger versions of the AB were built. In 1938, another revised version was built. This one was slightly smaller but equipped with a second 57mm gun. 11 of these 2-gun boats were built. Finally, a 1939 model, identical to the 1938 boat but with only one 57mm gun, also appeared. 19 of this model were produced. These would be the last of their line. The Sokotai-type armored gunboats would be superseded in Army service during the 1940s by the Ka-Ro-type boats, which were faster vessels similar to the British MTB or the American PT boat. With these craft in mind, we can form an idea of what a Japanese Army amphibious attack might have looked like in the minds of the planners of the late 20s and 30s. In general, the plan would be adapted from a regular land attack on an enemy line or fortified position. The guns of the Navy's warships of destroyer size and above would play the part normally assigned to artillery held at the battalion level and above, namely softening up enemy defense, interdiction of enemy communications, and the isolation of the battlefield by bombardment of reinforcements coming to the invasion beaches from elsewhere. Small craft such as the Sukhothai and some destroyers or other small warships provide more direct artillery support in response to calls from the assault troops. Landing craft would be lowered into the water from the attack transports and formed up into assault columns, while the gunboats and other supporting craft issued from the well decks and took up their positions. These gunboats would play the roles of the infantry's field guns and of fire support tanks. The landing craft would proceed to their assault sectors and discharge their infantry which, with the support of the guns of the warships and the Sukhothai, would overcome the beach defenses, securing a landing zone for subsequent loads of infantry and heavier weapons. Where possible, the frontal assault across the beach would be combined with flanking moves up rivers or other inlets, which would allow supporting forces to threaten the beach defenses with encirclement or otherwise compromise their position. All of this would proceed under air cover provided by the Army's land-based planes if possible, and of the naval aviation, with the landing force's own aviation operating from the landing ships in a liaison and scout/artillery spotter role. Later technological developments, such as amphibian tanks and landing ships capable of discharging their loads directly onto a beach, would be added to this picture, and the role of air power would become much more prominent as aircraft capabilities improved. But this would remain the Army's concept of the amphibious assault throughout the interwar period, and indeed throughout most of the Second World War. Now, let us turn to the ships that were employed to bring these craft to the enemy shores. Like the British, the Japanese at first envisioned the use of converted civilian merchant vessels to carry the landing craft. The initial Army attack transport concept was similar to that of the British landing ship infantry. They looked for vessels of about 10,000 tons displacement, which could then be adapted by some modification to their cargo spaces, the fitting of some guns, and the provision of stronger davits and other boat handling gear to lower the landing craft. Purpose-built military transports of conventional design would also be used in this role, likewise fitted with cranes and gear to lower assault craft over the sides. However, the Army's shipping engineers were conscious of the limitations of conversions of this kind, and requested the Navy's Design Bureau to draw up plans for a specialized vessel to carry landing forces. Design work was begun in March of 1933, construction followed, which was taken over in 1934 by the Navy, who designated it while building as a landing craft depot ship. In 1935, the ship, christened the Shinshu Maru, emerged from Kure Naval Yard and was delivered to the Army. This was the first ship built specifically as a landing craft carrier and amphibious assault vessel. It was a fairly large 7,000-ton ship, about 475 feet or 145 meters long, powered by steam turbines and capable of 20 knots. She carried a modest armament of 4 Type 88 75mm guns and a similar number of light anti-aircraft weapons. The Shinshu Maru was capable of carrying as many as 2,200 assault troops to the invasion beach. It was designed to carry 29 Daihatsu and 25 Shohatsu landing craft, as well as 4 of the Sukhothai armored gunboats, in addition to a small number of other amphibious craft such as scout and communications boats. The landing craft, gunboats, and other assault craft were launched either in the conventional way by being lowered into the water by davits, or by means of a well deck which could be flooded, and the craft launched directly out of gates at the stern 2 at a time. The ship also featured a garage deck where motor vehicles could be carried. Hatches in the ship's side led out from this deck onto a pier or other harbor installation from which the vehicles could be driven directly off the ship under their own power. These capabilities make them very similar in function to the later American LSDs, or landing ships dock, which also featured a floatable well deck of this kind. In addition, the Shinshu Maru was designed to operate catapult float planes to provide a degree of air support for the landings. As designed, the ship had 2 aircraft catapults and a planned complement of about 2 dozen seaplanes that would be supported from the vessel. These types of planes were not useful for bombing or fighter missions, but could be very valuable as scouts, as artillery spotters, as a deterrent to submarines, and in a liaison and communications role. In the event the catapults were removed before the ship was completed, this vessel did not operate planes in its service career. The Shinshu Maru participated in the Japanese landings that marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. In mid-August, she took part in the landings during the Second Battle of Shanghai, and later that month put men ashore at Tientsin. She was in action again in November, when she landed elements of the Army's 10th Division to the south of Shanghai at Jinshanwei. This landing was instrumental in inducing Chiang Kai-shek to issue orders pulling his forces away from the city on the 8th, and by the 12th the last Chinese units were falling back on Nanjing, thus ending 3 months of fighting in the city. She would be active in one more landing on the Chinese coast the next year, on October 12th of 1938, when she landed Lieutenant General Furusho Moto's 21st Division at Bias Bay, about 35 miles or 56 kilometers northeast of Hong Kong. The operation here was supported by the Japanese Fifth Fleet and by planes from Formosa or Taiwan. Carrier aircraft from the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Ryuho, and seaplanes operated by the tender Chitose also took part. These landings achieved strategic surprise, and the troops were able to push ahead against minimal resistance and capture Canton on the 21st. The success of this operation cut off Hong Kong and Macau from the rest of Chinese territory. In the Second World War, she was used in the invasions during the Dutch East India Campaign. She was accidentally struck by Japanese torpedoes during the Battle of the Sunda Strait on February 27, 1942, and sunk, but was refloated in September of that year and made seaworthy again on Java, then sent back to Ujina and Hiroshima Prefecture for permanent repairs. She took part in various convoy missions in the Southwest Pacific until January 3rd of 1945, when she was crippled by American planes from Task Force 38 while returning from a supply run to Lady Island. She was abandoned and then sunk by the submarine USS Aspro off at Takao. The Shinshu Maru is considered to be the first proper amphibious assault ship. 10 of these vessels were subsequently built by the Japanese, in somewhat different forms but all building on the capabilities of the original. A major advance was made with the follow-on Akitsu Maru, which was given a full flight deck and made capable of launching light Army aircraft to support the ground assault. This was in addition to the landing craft they could operate, and was a logical development of the catapult aircraft capability intended for the original Shinshu Maru. This ship, and its sisters the Kamano Maru and the Nagitsu Maru, look much like aircraft carriers. Their capabilities are limited by their size, however, which is quite a bit smaller than a proper carrier, and their lack of arrestor gear. Most aircraft could not land on her deck, so her aviation capability was similar to that of an aircraft ferry in most cases. These ships also lacked a hangar deck and stored their planes on the ship's main deck, over which the flight deck was built. They were able to operate light planes with short takeoff and landing runs, such as the Kokutai Ki-76, a light liaison spotter plane similar to the German Fieseler Storch, or the American L-4 Grasshopper, which was the military version of the Piper Cub. The Japanese also operated autogyros from these vessels, in particular the Kayaba Ka-1, which the Army used for artillery spotting, scouting, and anti-submarine patrol. This rotorcraft capability makes them the functional ancestor of the modern LHA-type amphibious vessel, which also operates landing craft and support aviation in the form of helicopters. The Shinshu Maru was the object of careful observation by American and British naval observers off Shanghai in 1937. It was immediately recognized that the technique of amphibious assault had taken a significant step forward. Another result of these experiences in China was the creation by the Japanese of the so-called SS-type landing ships. These were smaller vessels of 600 to 700 tons, outfitted to put ashore a load of 5 tanks or trucks, or 170 troops. The prototypes of this class, the ships Goro Maru and Yorihime Maru, were smaller vessels of 300 and 525 tons respectively. They were tested in exercises modeled on the landings at Bias Bay in October 1938. Here, the large landing craft carrier had been endangered as a result of the long time needed to deploy its full cargo using the relatively slow landing craft, which were obliged to make multiple trips back and forth from the ship to the shore. These smaller vessels were more quickly emptied, and could therefore leave the dangerous waters off the invasion beach more quickly. The tests were performed in 1939 and 1940, and their success led to the construction of the first SS type, the 650-ton Koryu, begun in the summer of 1941 and commissioned in April of 1942. A second and larger prototype followed, the 740-ton Banyu. These are diesel-powered vessels capable of 14 to 15 knots, 50 to 60 meters, or 165 to 195 feet long. The pair of prototypes were followed by 20 production models similar to the larger Banyu. These vessels were operated by 40-man crews and were armed with a Type 4 75mm gun and a Type 96 150mm infantry mortar to provide fire support to the invasion beach, as well as 3 Type 98 20mm automatic cannon as anti-aircraft defense. Series production of the SS type began in the second half of 1943. About 20 of these vessels were produced. Like their Western counterparts, the Japanese also took the next logical step in developing a landing ship which could itself be beached and discharge its cargo directly onto the shore. This was intended to carry armored vehicles and motor transport primarily, much like the British landing ship tank. This type of vessel was intended to supersede the SS-type ship. The Japanese effort bore fruit in the Nito Yusukan Type 101, or the Type 101 second-class transport, sometimes just called the T-101 class. The Navy had convinced the Army to opt for a smaller vessel than the LST, and the Type 101 had a displacement of only a little over 900 tons, or about a quarter of that of most marks of Allied LSTs. The first of these was delivered in 1942. They were larger than the SS type, with a length of 80 meters or 265 feet. The normal crew complement was about 90 sailors. The vessel could carry about 320 men, or between 5 and 13 armored vehicles, depending on the type. Alternatively, the Type 101 could carry a cargo payload of about 250 tons. In good condition, the ship could make 14 knots. It was powered by a pair of diesel engines. With a normal fuel load, these gave the Type 101 a radius of action of about 1,000 nautical miles. Only the first 6 of these vessels were completed with diesels. The remainder were built with steam turbines instead. These otherwise identical vessels were designated Type 103s. The substitution of the turbines for the diesels made the vessels slightly lighter and faster, with a maximum speed of 16 knots. However, their payload was slightly lessened compared to the T-101s by the need to carry boilers. Both types were armed with a single 76.2mm gun and a small number of depth charges to defend itself against surface and submarine threats, and also about half a dozen of the Type 96 25mm automatic cannon for anti-aircraft protection. These ships were also fitted with radar. Of the 69 that were built, 20 went to the Army and the rest remained in Navy hands. The Japanese also created another type of ship designed to conduct landing operations, one that was not paralleled in British experience. This was the 1,500-ton Ito Yusukan, or first-class fast transport. Sometimes designated T.1 class fast transports, these were essentially destroyers converted into fast attack transports. Similar vessels in the U.S. Navy at the time were designated as APDs. Some of these were actual conversions of older destroyers, but the majority were purpose-built ships based on a modified version of the design for the Matsu-class destroyer. The major changes from the destroyer design were the deletion of one set of engines to provide space for the cargo and troops, and the removal of turrets and other superstructure after the bridge and conning tower. The stern of the T-1 was also distinctive. These were sloped down to the waterline and fitted with rails and rollers by which embarked landing craft could be launched off the decks even while the ship was moving at speed. Designed to fit the Navy's idea of amphibious operation, it was fast, handy, and well-suited to the stealthy night landings of company-sized units of the Special Naval Landing Force. Though this may have been the idea when they were designed, these ships did not appear until 1943, when their characteristics made them more useful for high-speed resupply and reinforcement runs in areas not under Japanese sea or air control. They were in fact very well suited to the performance of these tasks, as well as amphibious raids and reconnaissance missions. However, They had insufficient lift for mounting a large-scale operation. Capable of 22 knots and with a 4,000 nautical mile steaming radius, these ships also retained much of a destroyer's armament, including a good anti-aircraft battery, the forward gun turret, and depth charges and sensors such as radar and sonar. Their amphibious capability came from the cleared deck aft of the superstructure, on which were carried forward Daihatsu-type landing craft, or a somewhat larger number of small craft or amphibian tanks. 46 were ordered in October of 1943. The design of the Ito Yusakan was further modified to carry midget submarines, Shinyo-type explosive kamikaze motorboats, or Kaiten human-piloted torpedoes. 15 were built at the Kure Naval Arsenal, and another 6 by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. These ships are optimized for mass production, and most were completed within 80 days of the keel being laid. The 22nd was nearing completion when the war ended. It was scrapped and the rest of the contract was cancelled. And so that is where I will end this video. I hope you found some of this interesting or useful. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time. Till then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.